This is the series documentary Lincoln's War Room, the political battles no one talks about. Today's episode 1, The Strategist in the Shadows, How Lincoln Outfoxed a Nation. Chapter 1, The Man in Marble, The Mind in Smoke. In the hushed rotunda of the Lincoln Memorial, the air carries a kind of reverence. Tourists speak in whispers, school groups hush their giggles. All eyes are drawn upward to a silent figure hewn from Georgia white marble, Abraham Lincoln. Seated, immovable, eternal, we are told he watches over a nation he preserved. We are told he freed the slaves. We are told he was a man of sorrow, of humility, of destiny. But statues do not strategize. They do not plot. They do not maneuver. They do not wait in silence to act at precisely the right moment. Men do, and Abraham Lincoln, flesh and blood Lincoln, was far more calculating than any monument could convey. By the way, everything you're about to hear is backed by real historical sources. Letters, memos, diaries, even his discarded drafts. We've gathered them all in the description, if you dare to follow the trail. The Lincoln etched into public consciousness, gentle, tragic, wise, is a masterpiece of American myth-making. It is not entirely false, but it is radically incomplete. In 1922, when sculptor Daniel Chester French unveiled the Lincoln statue, he called it a portrait of moral vision and fatherly serenity. But French had never seen the Lincoln who held cabinet meetings at midnight, who played generals against each other, who weaponized mercy like a scalpel. That Lincoln didn't sit in marble. He moved in smoke. Let's start with a moment most schoolbooks gloss over, the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the document that, so we are told, freed the slaves. Except it didn't, not immediately, not legally, not fully. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to slaves in Confederate-held territories, places over which Lincoln had no direct control. It excluded the 4 slave states that remained in the Union: Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. Slavery remained untouched there. Why? Because the goal was not simply to free people. It was to fracture the enemy's economy while keeping wavering Union states from defecting. It was not an act of pure morality. It was a move on the board. Lincoln even said as much. In August 1862, 5 months before the proclamation, he wrote to editor Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." That letter, by the way, is also in the description, along with the drafts of the proclamation itself. They reveal a man not driven by passion, but by precision, and the timing of the proclamation, also strategic. Lincoln had the final draft in his desk for weeks, but he waited for a battlefield victory. It came at Antietam, bloody, costly, but technically a Union success. Only then did he announce it, because had he issued it after a loss, it would have looked desperate. After a win, it looked righteous. Even the imagery of Lincoln, the reluctant liberator, is calculated. It reinforces the idea that he acted from deep conscience, not political advantage. But make no mistake, Lincoln understood the stage. He understood narrative, and he knew when to play the long game. That doesn't make him a fraud. It makes him formidable. He understood that in war, especially civil war, optics are weapons. He rarely moved first, he moved last and best. Take the issue of suspending habeas corpus. When civil liberties were being violated, journalists jailed, dissenters silenced, Lincoln didn't grandstand. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" It's an elegant way of saying, "I'll break the law to save the law." Now let's talk about his cabinet. Lincoln didn't just appoint his political enemies. He invited them in, one by one: William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates, all of them better known, more experienced, more ambitious than he was. He placed them around him like chess pieces, and he moved them accordingly. He let Seward think he was running the show, until, in the early days of the war, Seward attempted to send a memo proposing that the cabinet should collectively make decisions, and that he, Seward, should control foreign policy. Lincoln let him submit the memo. Then he quietly reminded Seward, who had the signature on the bottom of every order. Seward backed off. This was not the action of a gentle rail splitter. This was a man who used deference as a tactic. Let's go even deeper. Lincoln would sometimes write scathing letters to his generals, especially to George McClellan, who hesitated on the battlefield. But instead of sending those letters, Lincoln would often put them in a drawer. He would wait. Sometimes he would never send them at all. He wasn't suppressing anger. He was weaponizing patience. A general might find himself out of command weeks later, not because Lincoln attacked him, but because Lincoln created a situation in which others had to act on his behalf. He preserved his moral capital while executing cold, ruthless decisions. Even Lincoln's sense of humor served a purpose. He diffused tension with jokes. He distracted rivals with folksy tales. But those stories weren't random. They were rhetorical ambushes. A political opponent would finish laughing, only to realize they just agreed with him. We've listed some of his most famous political parables in the description. They may sound like folklore. Read between the lines, and they're blueprints. Lincoln didn't dress the part of a manipulator. He slouched. He wore ill-fitting suits. He seemed awkward, self-deprecating, humble, and people underestimated him every time. One observer wrote, "He looked like a man who had never quite caught up with his own limbs." But that was the point. When you don't look dangerous, you can act dangerous without being suspected. Here's another plot twist. Lincoln did not win the presidency because of national popularity. He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. He won because the Democratic vote was split between Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell. Lincoln was a second-choice candidate who became the last man standing. And who engineered that fractured race? Lincoln's team did. He understood that sometimes the best way to win is to help others lose. The myth says Lincoln was thrust into greatness by events beyond his control. The reality is, he helped create those events. And when his face was carved into stone, the shadows were carved with it. We've linked the real letters and war room memos Lincoln left behind, if you're ready to see behind the statue. Because this is not the story of a man who was carried by history. This is the story of a man who steered it. And if you want to understand how a soft-spoken man from Illinois became the most powerful figure in America, without shouting, without marching, without firing a single shot, then meet him where he began. In a courtroom, wearing a suit that didn't fit, standing in front of 12 strangers, ready to win him over not with power, but with something far more dangerous, language. That's where we're headed next. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where real history sounds like legend. We don't just tell stories, we resurrect them. Chapter 2, Country Lawyer or Calculating Genius. He looked like no one's idea of a political threat. Abraham Lincoln, in his 30s, rode from courthouse to courthouse across central Illinois with a carpetbag, mismatched clothes, and the horse that locals joked was uglier than he was. His pants never seemed to fit. His top hat looked like it had fought a thunderstorm and lost. When he stood, he slouched. When he sat, he sprawled. And when he spoke, he hesitated. But people stayed to listen. Lincoln's years as a prairie lawyer weren't a sideshow to his presidency. They were his training ground, his dojo, his battlefield. And in that dusty, informal world of log cabins and jury trials, Lincoln became something few of his opponents ever realized until it was too late. A political weapon with the precision of a scalpel and the patience of a spider. Between 1837 and 1860, Lincoln tried over 5,000 cases. Most were small, property disputes, debt collections, slander. But within those cases lay patterns, tactics, and maneuvers that would later reappear, sometimes word for word, on the biggest stages in American history. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he used three weapons better than almost anyone in his generation: silence, storytelling, and strategic contradiction. Let's start with silence. Contemporaries often remarked how Lincoln would sit through long debates or arguments, almost motionless, chin in hand, eyes half closed. Sometimes he looked like he was dozing off, but when his turn came, he would stand, stretched to his gangly full height, and calmly, surgically deconstruct the entire argument his opponent had spent hours building. He let them overtalk, oversell, overpromise. Then he'd cut the legs out from under them with a single sentence. One lawyer, William Herndon, who later became Lincoln's law partner, said of Lincoln's method, he never interrupted. He never seemed to care. But when he spoke, you could feel every man in the room lean in. Lincoln understood that silence made people underestimate him. And if they weren't underestimating him, they were overreaching. It wasn't laziness, it was setting a trap. Now take storytelling. In court, Lincoln rarely led with facts. He led with fables. If a witness contradicted himself, Lincoln wouldn't point it out directly. He'd tell a story about a farmer who once tried to ride two horses going in opposite directions. If a prosecutor grandstanded, Lincoln wouldn't object. He'd tell a story about a man who talked so much about shooting that no one ever believed he owned a gun. At first, this seemed like backwards humor, folksy charm, theatrics. But it wasn't. It was control. Every story was a metaphor. Every metaphor was a frame. And once Lincoln framed a trial his way, the jury rarely noticed the technicalities anymore. They had already chosen the side they wanted to believe. Want to read the courtroom speech that turned voters into disciples? It's one scroll away. But perhaps Lincoln's most lethal skill, his third weapon, was contradiction. Not contradiction of himself, contradiction of the moment. He would open with what seemed like weakness, admitting a small flaw in his case, conceding a point to the opposition, even agreeing with part of the accusation. Then, just as the jury relaxed, thinking he had given up ground, he would pivot hard and land his real argument in a place they hadn't expected. In 1841, in the case of Bailey versus Cromwell, Lincoln represented a young black woman who had been sold as a slave in Illinois. Now, slavery was technically illegal in Illinois, but enforcement was murky. Lincoln didn't make a moral argument. He didn't preach. Instead, he argued a technicality under Illinois law. The burden of proof was on the person claiming ownership, not the person claiming freedom. It was quiet, undramatic, and devastating. He didn't argue slavery was wrong. He argued it couldn't be proven legal in that specific instance. He wasn't playing to emotion. He was controlling the rules of the game. That tactic, pivoting the frame from morality to legality, then letting the opponent overextend, would reappear again and again in Lincoln's political battles, including his famous debates with Stephen Douglas almost 2 decades later. And what about those debates? We're getting there. But first, let's talk about Lincoln's use of character as a courtroom device. He often lost the beginning of a trial on purpose. He allowed his client to appear foolish. He allowed the opposition to dominate the early narrative. Jurors thought Lincoln was outmatched. And then, always near the end, he transformed. He would pause, shift tone, and slowly, surgically change the moral framing of the trial. Suddenly, the jurors weren't evaluating legal terms. They were choosing sides in a human story. He made him feel as if they were being judged. 2. It was persuasion beyond logic. It was psychology, and he learned it not from books, but from years of riding dusty roads, eating with jurors, and understanding how people thought when no one was watching. And then, there was the disarming power of awkwardness. Lincoln leaned into his appearance. He made fun of his own face. He made fun of his voice. He made fun of his poverty. One reporter noted that in his early debates, Lincoln looked like a scarecrow who had read the Constitution. Lincoln smiled at that, then he used it. He knew that once people laughed at him, they dropped their guard, and once their guard was down, he made his move. Here's the twist. Lincoln's backwards charm, his plain speech, his humility. They were all real, but they were also weapons. Not lies, but tools. And he used them to carve out a political identity no one else could copy. Because no one else could wield contradiction the way he could. He was not trying to sound smart. He was trying to sound like America. And it worked. He became the kind of figure people didn't just vote for, but defended. He turned political followers into disciples. And it all started in the courtroom, where juries mistook him for a bumbling lawyer until he spoke and left them in stunned silence. We've linked several transcripts of Lincoln's legal arguments, including the one that sealed his reputation as the voice of common sense. Read them. You'll see how a local lawyer from Springfield turned 12 strangers into a united front, and how that same technique scaled into national politics. Because the next time Lincoln stepped onto a stage, it wouldn't be to win over a jury of 12. It would be to challenge an entire nation. And the tool he would use wasn't law. It was language. Next up, Chapter 3. Words sharper than swords. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He never threatened. And yet, when Abraham Lincoln spoke, men squirmed in their seats, shifted in their alliances, and sometimes changed history. Words were his artillery, syntax, his strategy, metaphor, his musket. He had no army, no budget, not even a proper political machine. But in June of 1858, in a packed hall in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln stood before a sea of delegates and dropped a sentence so sharp it nearly cut his party in half. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Just like that, the room froze, and so did the Republican Party. Let's set the stage. It was the evening of June 16, 1858. Lincoln had just secured the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. The hall was warm, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and ambition. Delegates filed into the Illinois state capitol, expecting the usual acceptance speech. Thank yous, vague promises, stirring but safe language. What they got instead was a line lifted straight from the Gospel of Mark. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a threat. Lincoln continued, I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. He didn't stop there. He accused the nation's political elite, including his future opponent, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, of conspiring to make slavery legal in every state. He called out the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. He painted a picture of creeping pro-slavery expansion, inch by inch, decision by decision, until one day, slavery wouldn't just be tolerated in the South. It would be demanded in the North. He was warning that the storm was already inside the house, and either the house would fall, or something had to change. That one line turned a party upside down. It's printed below, alongside the fall speech. But in that moment, the room didn't burst into applause. There were no standing ovations. There was, instead, silence. Even many of Lincoln's allies were stunned. Some panicked. His law partner, William Herndon, had seen the speech in draft form and begged Lincoln to tone it down. He said it would be political suicide. Other Republicans, more moderate, feared it would alienate swing voters. It didn't just criticize the Democrats, it called out the silence of Lincoln's own party. And they weren't wrong to worry. Newspapers blasted Lincoln's remarks the next morning. Editors called him reckless, divisive, even dangerous. The Chicago Times compared him to a fanatic preacher. But Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't trying to win the middle. He was trying to redefine it. He knew that in a time of crisis, clarity could look like extremism, but ambiguity would look like cowardice. And here's the twist. Lincoln lost the election. Yes, after months of campaigning against Stephen Douglas in a series of legendary debates. Lincoln lost the Senate race. Douglas won the seat, but Lincoln's words won the future. The debates have been covered nationwide. Excerpts were printed in every major paper, and "House Divided" became more than a phrase. It became a position, a slogan, a line in the sand. 2 years later, when the Republican Party needed a presidential candidate in 1860, they didn't choose the polished senators. They didn't choose the powerful governors. They chose the lawyer from Springfield, the man who had drawn the clearest contrast. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He had lost the battle, but he had framed the war. Let's talk tactics. The brilliance of the House Divided speech wasn't just in the wording. It was in the setup. Lincoln didn't begin with attacks. He began with prophecy. He painted a vision of the country, not as it was, but as it was becoming. He described a future where the law would no longer tolerate compromise, where the Constitution would be weaponized, where courts, legislatures, and presidents would all begin to shift under the gravitational pull of slavery. And he did it in the language of Scripture. He made disagreement feel apocalyptic, and that forced a question: which side are you on? By invoking the Bible, Lincoln wasn't pandering to religion. He was borrowing its weight. He was saying, this isn't about policy. This is about moral architecture. What kind of foundation can this country rest on? Can it bear the weight of contradiction? He knew the answer, but he wanted others to say it out loud. That's the mark of a true strategist. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to be heard. And once you heard him, you couldn't forget. By the way, we've linked the full House Divided speech below, plus the annotated version, with historical context and cross-referenced court decisions. Read it, then ask yourself, if someone said these words today, would they be called radical or visionary? Now here's the part most people miss. Lincoln didn't write the speech in a burst of inspiration. He worked on it for weeks, maybe months. His drafts show edits in pencil, entire paragraphs crossed out, phrases rewritten again and again. He tested metaphors, rearranged logic, balanced the cadence of each line. One observer noted that Lincoln read the speech aloud dozens of times to himself, listening for rhythm, gauging its emotional flow. This wasn't improvisation, it was architecture. He even had a backup line in case the House Divided metaphor bombed. That's how prepared he was. But he didn't use it, because he understood something few politicians dared admit. Sometimes, the goal is not to persuade everyone. Sometimes, the goal is to reveal who already agrees, and then give them a reason to follow. Lincoln knew the room might recoil, but he also knew the country was listening. And he was speaking to the country that didn't yet exist, to the one he was about to help create. We often think of Lincoln as a reluctant leader, humble, modest, almost accidental. But no one who writes a sentence like, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," is accidental. That sentence was a blade, and he wielded it with full intent. And so, while Douglas celebrated his Senate seat, Lincoln quietly gathered letters of support from across the North. Ministers, lawyers, factory owners, young activists. He began receiving invitations to speak in other states. Newspapers reprinted his words like scripture. He had lost in Illinois, but he had become the voice of the Republic. That is how you lose a race and win a revolution. And he would do it again. Because next, Lincoln was going to pull off one of the most counterintuitive moves in American political history. He would become president, not by being the first choice, but by being the second choice of almost everyone. Chapter 4, The Second Choice Strategy. Chicago, May 1860. A storm of banners, cigars, and ambition. The Republican National Convention had just begun inside a wooden coliseum built for the occasion. Nicknamed the Wigwam, thousands of delegates, journalists, and political operatives crowded into the steaming hall. Names buzzed through the air like firecrackers. William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates. Not Lincoln. He wasn't even in the room. He stayed in Springfield. He claimed he didn't want to appear overeager, but those who knew him best understood. Lincoln never left his chances to chance. He knew exactly what he was doing. At that convention, Abraham Lincoln would pull off one of the most improbable victories in political history, not by being anyone's first choice, but by making himself everyone's safest second. It's what political strategists today call the second choice strategy. Let's break it down. Seward, the former governor and senator from New York, was the clear front runner. He had the money, the media, and the machine. But he also had baggage. He was seen as too radical on slavery, too tied to party bosses, and too arrogant by many moderates and former Whigs. Chase of Ohio had integrity, abolitionist credentials, and a loyal base, but he was cold, aloof, and didn't play well with others. Bates was the choice of conservatives and old-school Republicans, but he was considered too old, too vague, and too sympathetic to the South. Each candidate had strengths, but each also had factions that hated him. Lincoln had fewer enemies, and that's where the strategy began. He and his team, most notably political operator David Davis and newspaper editor Norman Judd, knew they couldn't win on the first ballot. But they believed something more important. No one else could either. They studied the delegate count state by state. They mapped out rivalries and grudges. They targeted swing delegations like Indiana and Pennsylvania, not to win outright, but to lock them into a second-round pivot if Seward stumbled. And Seward would stumble, because front-runners often do. Lincoln's team flooded the wigwam with supporters, many wearing matching red and white hats. They handed out rail splitter badges. They staged chants. They planted delegates to start cheers on cue. It was early political theater, and it worked. Most importantly, they made Lincoln appear inevitable. They arranged for his name to be placed into nomination by a rising Republican star named John M. Ashmun, who delivered a booming speech that compared Lincoln to Henry Clay. Then, they printed thousands of extra copies of the speech and gave them to delegates during the first ballot. But here's the real twist. Lincoln had instructed his team not to attack Seward. Not once, not ever. Why? Because if Seward faltered, Lincoln didn't want his fingerprints on the bruises. That silence was not weakness. It was positioning. Let's look at the vote breakdown. On the first ballot, Seward led with 173.5 votes. Lincoln trailed with 102. On the second, Seward climbed to 184.5. Lincoln jumped to 181. On the third ballot, Lincoln surged to 231.5, just 1.5 votes shy of the nomination. A dramatic pause swept the room. Then 4 Ohio delegates changed their votes to Lincoln. The whole erupted. Pandemonium, pandering, pandemonium again. Lincoln had done it, and we've uncovered the original convention map. See how the dark horse cornered the field. It's linked below. Now, here's the part history classes skip. Lincoln knew his rise depended on staying out of sight. He refused to travel to Chicago. He said it would be improper, but in reality, his absence made him feel dignified, mysterious, almost presidential. He controlled the narrative by withholding himself. And while others made deals in person, Lincoln made impressions. His campaign biography, written by John Locke Scribs, circulated heavily before the convention. It painted him as humble, hard-working, and honest, a man of the people. It left out his legal brilliance, his ruthless strategy, his complex racial views. It was a character sketch in sepia tones. And it worked. Delegates who didn't know Lincoln personally thought they did. That's not an accident. That's marketing. But even as his team maneuvered for votes, Lincoln kept his hands clean. When friends asked if they could promise cabinet positions in exchange for delegate support, Lincoln responded carefully, "Make no contracts that bind me." He knew deals were being made, but he wanted deniability. That's the second choice strategy in full form. Be present without being seen. Be available without being obvious. Let others burn their bridges, then cross over when the smoke clears. And there's one more layer. Lincoln made sure to appear moderate on slavery without ever retreating from his moral compass. His debates with Douglas had made him look principled, but his silence since then had made him look stable. Delegates didn't know exactly what Lincoln would do, but they believed he wouldn't scare the nation. That mattered, because 1860 was a powder keg, and delegates didn't want to light the match. So they chose Lincoln, not because he was the most charismatic, or the most radical, or the most beloved, but because he was the most acceptable, and that made him electable. Political genius often looks like luck. But luck usually has a strategist behind it. Lincoln didn't rise because others failed. He rose because he let them fail without getting in the way. And when the dust settled, his name was the only one left without baggage, without enemies, and without controversy. He became the nominee because no one feared him. They should have, because what came next would shake the very foundations of the nation. He would enter the presidency with no mandate, no military experience, no united party, and he would still find a way to take control. But first, he had to win an election, and he was about to do it using a campaign strategy no one in Washington was ready for. If you've made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe, there's more coming. Chapter 5, Playing Checkers While They Played Chess. Summer 1860, the Union was splitting at the seams. The South was threatening secession. Democrats were tearing each other apart. And the press was aflame with one word: slavery. In the middle of it all stood Abraham Lincoln. Except, he didn't, while his opponents crisscrossed the nation, thundering from podiums, shouting over roaring crowds, and taking hard-line stances that risked alienating half the country. Lincoln did something unthinkable. He stayed home. Literally, he remained in Springfield, Illinois, never campaigned in person, rarely answered attacks, and when he did speak, it was usually through surrogates, or in carefully constructed letters that sounded more like parables than positions. His opponents thought he was passive, detached, maybe even afraid, but Lincoln wasn't playing the game. While the other candidates played checkers, frantic, tactical, move by move, Lincoln played chess, slow, strategic, and always 10 steps ahead. Let's break it down. There were 4 major candidates in the general election of 1860. Stephen A. Douglas, Northern Democrat, waffled on slavery, believed in popular sovereignty, let states decide. John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, pro-slavery, backed by the Deep South. John Bell, Constitutional Union Party, tried to avoid the slavery question entirely. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, opposed the spread of slavery, but carefully avoided radical rhetoric. Each man appealed to a different America, and each expected the race to be fought in fire. But Lincoln refused to light a match. Instead of barnstorming speeches, he released letters to the editor. Instead of attacks, he sent polite thank-you notes. Instead of stoking outrage, he told voters he trusted their wisdom. It wasn't humility, it was strategy, because Lincoln understood something his rivals didn't. Every public stance in 1860 had a cost. Defend abolition, lose conservative swing states. Defend slavery, lose the North. Say nothing, appear weak. So Lincoln found a fourth option: speak in riddles. We've included one of his most telling unsent campaign letters in the description. Read it closely. There's a sentence he wrote and then crossed out. You'll see exactly how close he came to saying too much. There's a letter he never sent during the campaign. We linked it below. Decide for yourself if it was cowardice or brilliance. Now here's where the genius unfolds. While he stayed home, others fought for him. Republican surrogates fanned out across the North. Newspapers friendly to the cause published glowing profiles. His campaign biography, crafted with surgical care, circulated widely. The portrait was clear: a man of the people, born in a log cabin, raised by hard work, honest Abe. Never mind that Lincoln was now a wealthy lawyer, or that he was one of the sharpest political minds of his era. He let the image form and never corrected it. His team fed journalists pre-approved lines. They printed speeches with key phrases underlined. They coordinated letters to the editor. They even organized wide-awake rallies, torchlight processions of young Republican supporters wearing capes and hats, chanting for Lincoln without ever quoting him directly. It was a masterclass in decentralization. Let others say the dangerous things. He would say nothing and own everything. And then there's the South. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. Not because he was unqualified, but because those states refused to print his name. His campaign didn't fight it, didn't challenge it, didn't sue. They let it happen. Because Lincoln's strategy was never about national consensus. It was about strategic pluralities. He knew he didn't need to win the South. He just needed to hold the North. And he did, barely. Here's the vote breakdown. Lincoln won just under 40% of the popular vote, but he secured 180 electoral votes, more than enough to win. He didn't need to win the most hearts. He needed to win the right maps. Think about that. He won the presidency while being literally unknown to millions of Americans. That's not luck. That's surgical calculation. And then, of course, came the reaction. The South exploded. Secession began. Threats of civil war filled the newspapers. And once again, Lincoln said almost nothing. Why? Because if he spoke too soon, he would become the cause of the conflict. So he waited, not out of fear, but out of framing. Let the South make the first move. Then, when the war came, it would be a response, not a provocation. He would hold the moral high ground without firing a shot. And while this silent campaign unfolded, Lincoln kept detailed records. He read every newspaper editorial, tracked public reactions, kept notes on border state sentiments. He wrote out versions of his first inaugural address months before the election was even over. Because he knew, the moment he stepped into office, the campaign would end, and the war for the Union would begin. And once again, he would need to outmaneuver men louder, richer, and more connected than him. But he would have one advantage. He had already beaten them by not playing the game. Chapter 6, Rivals in the Room. Puppets on strings. It was political suicide. That's what nearly everyone said when Abraham Lincoln began to assemble his cabinet. William H. Seward, the famed New York senator and Republican frontrunner he had just defeated for the nomination. Lincoln offered him Secretary of State. Salmon P. Chase, the Ohio governor who had challenged him from the abolitionist flank. Lincoln tapped him for Secretary of the Treasury. Edward Bates, the conservative Missouri elder favored by ex-Whigs. Lincoln named him Attorney General. Each man thought he should have been president, and Lincoln invited them into the room. If this were a novel, you'd say the hero had lost his mind. If it were a Netflix drama, you'd expect betrayal by episode 3. But in the smoke-filled halls of Washington in 1861, Lincoln wasn't gathering friends. He was building a chessboard. The cabinet of Abraham Lincoln, famously labeled by historian Doris Kearns Goodwin as a team of rivals, wasn't just a unity gesture. It was a trap. Click to see the cabinet seating chart and how it mirrored a trap. Let's set the scene. March 4th, 1861. Lincoln enters the White House under threat. 7 southern states have already seceded. More on the brink. Washington is surrounded by slave states. The government is divided. The Republican Party is fractured. Lincoln himself is considered a novice, a backwards lawyer, a compromise candidate, and the men around him, they think they're in charge. Especially William Seward. Seward arrived in Washington certain he would be the real power behind the presidency. He had the experience, the contacts, the confidence. He told friends that he would guide Lincoln through the early days of crisis. In private, he considered himself the prime minister of the American government. But Lincoln had already read Seward's moves. He let Seward believe he was in control for just long enough. Then, at a key moment, he flipped the board. Seward drafted a proposal during the Fort Sumter crisis suggesting that the United States provoke a foreign war to unify the country. He proposed a series of bold, dangerous moves and insisted Lincoln act quickly. Lincoln read the memo, then waited. 2 days later, he responded, not with anger, but with an annotation, in quiet, cutting language. He reminded Seward that there was only one president. He declined the recommendations, and the illusion shattered. Seward backed down. From that point on, he served Lincoln, not the other way around. But Seward wasn't the only rival turned pawn. Salmon Chase believed Lincoln too cautious, too moderate. As Treasury Secretary, he built a separate political machine within the administration, angling for a presidential run in 1864, even while serving under Lincoln. Lincoln didn't stop him. He let Chase overplay his hand. He allowed him to submit multiple letters of resignation, only to decline them. Every time, until the timing was perfect. In June 1864, just after securing renomination, Lincoln finally accepted Chase's resignation. The message was clear: Lincoln no longer needed him. And what of Edward Bates? The conservative jurist quickly found himself outmaneuvered in legal arguments by Lincoln's own logical agility. He faded into the background, a respected elder without real power. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, called Lincoln the most reticent and secretive man I ever knew. Yet somehow, Lincoln got everything he needed out of each cabinet member, without ever revealing more than he had to. He used their strengths, studied their flaws, and controlled the game by refusing to be predictable. He let them argue, he let them compete, he let them believe, and when the time came, he made the decisions. That wasn't weakness, it was mastery. Lincoln's cabinet meetings were notoriously loose. He didn't vote, he didn't force consensus, he listened, then acted alone. While his rivals played politics inside the room, Lincoln played for the nation beyond it. He used internal disagreements as camouflage. The press could report chaos, the South could assume confusion. But Lincoln was never confused. Every disagreement gave him leverage. Every ego gave him cover. Every rival became a distraction from the man actually in control. It's worth remembering that in 1861, no president had ever faced such a catastrophic scenario: secession, civil war, assassination threats, foreign intrigue, financial collapse, and Lincoln faced it with a team of ambitious, divided, self-interested men, and he beat him all. Not by confrontation, but by calibration. He spoke last, he listened long, he gave ground when it cost him nothing. And then, when no one expected it, he moved decisively. He replaced generals, issued proclamations, rewrote policy, all while the people who wanted his job were still trying to figure out what he was thinking. By 1862, the men who once considered Lincoln a figurehead now referred to him as the only indispensable man in Washington. He had, in 2 years, transformed a room full of rivals into a council of spectators. And yet, he kept the image of humility. He joked with them, he told stories, he asked for advice he didn't need, and he rarely let them see his hand. Even his letters, crafted carefully, edited in private, left just enough ambiguity to let others project their assumptions. Some called it folksy. It was psychological warfare, because when you control the minds in the room, you don't need to control the room itself. And Lincoln's genius wasn't that he surrounded himself with the best men. It's that he made the best men think he needed them. In reality, they needed him. And when one of them finally pushed too far, tried to become something more than a puppet, Lincoln was ready. That man's name, William H. Seward, and what came next would decide who truly ran the Union. Which Lincoln move surprised you most so far? Drop your answer below. We read every comment. Chapter 7, The Seward Situation. William H. Seward had waited his entire career for this moment. He had been governor of New York, senator, a leading voice in the Republican Party, and, until Lincoln's unlikely nomination, the presumed next president of the United States. Now, in March 1861, he stood in the cabinet room of the White House as Lincoln's Secretary of State. Convinced of one thing, Abraham Lincoln was in over his head. To Seward, Lincoln was a useful figurehead, a compromise candidate, a man from the frontier who could smile, shake hands, and read speeches, but surely not command a government in crisis. Seward, ever confident, told friends he would direct the helm until Lincoln found his footing. He wouldn't need long, just 1 week. That was all it took for Lincoln to flip the board. It remains one of the greatest power reversals in American political history. We've posted the infamous draft letter where Seward tried to take over. Lincoln's reply, a silent slap. Let's rewind. On April 1st, 1861, less than a month into Lincoln's presidency, Seward handed him a private memorandum titled, "Some Faults for the President's Consideration." It was 4 pages long. It started with a compliment. Then it escalated. In it, Seward accused the administration of lacking direction, suggested that Lincoln had too many heads, and proposed a new course of action. The punchline: Seward volunteered himself to implement that course, to set policy, to lead both foreign and domestic strategy while Lincoln presided. It was a veiled coup. He wasn't suggesting a different presidency. He was offering to become its pilot. Now pause for a moment. It's easy to read this today and scoff at the arrogance. But in early 1861, it wasn't crazy. Lincoln had no experience in national government. The nation was collapsing. The military was fractured. Washington, D.C., was barely defendable. And Seward, seasoned, respected, connected, was offering leadership. He expected Lincoln to yield. Instead, Lincoln read the memo, paused, folded it, and waited. Then, calmly, precisely, he responded. He didn't confront Seward. He didn't fire him. He didn't even reject the ideas outright. He did something much colder. He annotated the memo line by line, acknowledging suggestions, pointing out logical flaws, and concluding by reminding Seward that all decisions would be made by the president. And that, in case Seward had forgotten, was Abraham Lincoln. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. That quiet rebuke re-established the balance of power, and everyone in the room knew it. Seward backed down. From that day forward, he served Lincoln's vision, not his own. But Lincoln wasn't done. In the days that followed, he subtly reshuffled influence within the cabinet. He met individually with other members, clarified their roles, set expectations. No drama, no headlines, just silent architecture. Lincoln turned a team of rivals into an orbit around himself without a single explosion. But there's more. In private, Seward told confidants he had misjudged the man. He hadn't expected Lincoln to be so composed, so analytical, so in control. He is the best listener I've ever known, Seward later admitted, and the most decisive once he's heard enough. That's not a compliment, that's a concession. Now let's talk psychology. Lincoln didn't win that confrontation because he was clever. He won because he understood Seward better than Seward understood him. He knew Seward thrived on being the smartest man in the room. So Lincoln let him talk. He let him plan. And then, at the perfect moment, he stripped away the illusion. It wasn't domination, it was dismantling. It's worth noting that Lincoln never removed Seward from office. In fact, they grew closer over time. Seward became a trusted advisor, instrumental in foreign affairs. But the power dynamic was never questioned again. And that's the genius. Lincoln didn't need to win arguments. He made others walk away from theirs. There's a myth that Lincoln governed by consensus. He didn't. He governed by orchestration. He gave his cabinet space to speak, but not to steer. And the Seward affair was his first and clearest demonstration. He made his point without making an enemy. That's the highest level of political skill, not victory, control. And here's the plot twist. The American people never knew. It wasn't leaked. It wasn't scandalized. It played out entirely in the quiet halls of the West Wing, between two men who had come into the White House with very different ideas of who would be in charge. Only one of them walked out with his hands on the reins. Lincoln. We've posted the original Thoughts for the President memo and Lincoln's annotations. Look at them side by side. One is confident, the other is final. So, why does this matter? Because this pattern would repeat itself. Again and again, ambitious men would enter Lincoln's orbit. They would test him, and they would find, often too late, that behind the folksy charm, the loose clothing, and the soft speech, there was an iron core. A man who didn't bluff. He simply waited, and when he moved, it was too late to respond. Now, we move to a different kind of confrontation. One that never happened in public. One written in ink, never mailed. A letter of fire and silence. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where real history sounds like legend. We don't just tell stories, we resurrect them. Chapter 8, Letters that were never meant to be sent. He called them hop letters. Abraham Lincoln would sit alone, often late at night, seething over a general's blunder, a cabinet member's arrogance, or a newspaper editor's slander. He would take out pen and paper, and he would write, every word sharpened, every sentence loaded with quiet fire. Then he would fold the letter, slip it into an envelope, seal it, and never send it. Not a stall tactic, not procrastination. This was intentional. It was the highest form of emotional discipline, and one of Lincoln's most lethal political techniques. We saved some of his unsent drafts. Warning: they sting sharper than published words. This wasn't just a personal quirk. It was a system. The most famous of these hop letters came in the summer of 1863. Days after the Battle of Gettysburg, General George G. Meade had just won the largest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Lee's forces were reeling, retreating south. The North was on the verge of a potentially war-ending breakthrough. And then Meade let them go. He failed to pursue, failed to trap, failed to finish. Lincoln was furious. In a letter to Meade, he wrote, "My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. You had him within your grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. It's brutal, it's cold, it's absolutely correct." And Lincoln never sent it. He folded the letter, marked it, to General Meade, never sent or signed, and placed it in a drawer. Why? Because in that moment, Lincoln understood something deeper than strategy. He understood morale. Meade had just delivered the Union's first major battlefield victory. He was still a hero in the public eye. A scolding from the president might crush the man, or worse, turn him against the administration. Lincoln didn't need to humiliate Meade. He just needed him to understand. And so the letter remained private until decades later, when it was found, still sealed. You can read it now. We've included it in the description, along with others, less famous, but just as telling. The hop letter was Lincoln's pressure valve and his scalpel. He would write what he couldn't say, and in doing so, he avoided wars of ego that would have derailed his real war. But sometimes, the unsent letter was more than a personal exercise. Sometimes, it was bait. In 1864, during tensions within his own cabinet, Lincoln drafted responses to certain advisors, but left them incomplete. The recipients would learn through back channels that the president was drafting a reply. The implication: you're being watched. It was political theater, whispered discipline, and it worked. His rivals adjusted, softened, realigned, all without Lincoln ever lifting a rhetorical blade. It's what the Stoics might call mastery of self as mastery of others. But it didn't always come easy. On multiple occasions, Lincoln admitted to his secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, that writing such letters was the only way he kept from exploding. He once joked, "If I didn't write him down, I'd have to start shouting, and that'd just scare the horses." Was he joking? Probably. Was he telling the truth? Absolutely. Let's step back for a moment. Imagine the pressure Lincoln was under, holding a fractured cabinet together, managing battlefield disasters, dodging assassination threats, navigating a press that vilified him daily. And all of this while watching thousands of men die every week under his command. And still, no Twitter threads, no angry telegrams, just ink. That's not just emotional restraint. That's presidential warfare. We often mistake silence for passivity. But Lincoln's silence was armor, and his never send letters were arrows sharpened, drawn, and quietly set down. They reveal a side of Lincoln rarely taught in schools. Not the great emancipator, not the melancholy philosopher, but the tactician of restraint. The man who won by not fighting. Now for a twist. Sometimes, the unsent letter was actually a precursor, a rehearsal. Lincoln would draft a hop letter, cool down, and then write a public version, stripped of heat, but loaded with warning. It was political judo. Use the enemy's momentum against them, but never meet them head-on. Case in point, his response to critics in the press. Instead of firing back at hostile newspapers, Lincoln would write statements that never named the enemy, but redefined the argument. He didn't say, "You're wrong." He said, "This is the truth," and truth, once spoken, doesn't need an opponent, it just needs time. Modern politicians lash out, Lincoln waited. Modern leaders retaliate, Lincoln redirected. Modern egos implode, Lincoln folded the letter, sealed it, and put it away. He wasn't avoiding conflict, he was controlling the field. And by doing so, he preserved his focus for the only war that mattered. One fought not in ink, but in blood. So ask yourself, how many of today's crises could be avoided by writing what we feel and never hitting send? Because the man who held the Union together in its darkest hour never needed to win the argument. He just needed to understand it, and when it came time to act, he acted alone. Now, in the next chapter, we'll watch how Lincoln used this same silent method, not just to handle emotion, but to control outcomes, because sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones no one sees. Chapter 9, Silent Moves. Loud Consequences. George B. McClellan didn't see it coming. He was too busy complaining about supply lines, fortifications, and the utter unreliability of his intelligence reports. He wrote long letters from lavish headquarters miles away from the front. He refused to attack without perfect conditions. He talked of grand strategy, but did very little grand. He believed himself to be the only man capable of saving the Union. Lincoln believed otherwise, but he didn't say it. He didn't call McClellan a coward. He didn't fire him in a fit of rage. He didn't stage a dramatic confrontation. He simply changed the conditions. And McClellan, like so many before and after, walked straight into the space Lincoln left for him. Let's rewind to the spring of 1862. The war had dragged on longer than anyone expected. Bloodier, costlier. The Union was frustrated, and Washington was on edge. McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, was beloved by his men. Young, dashing, organized, he rebuilt the army after the disaster at Bull Run. He drilled them, he equipped them, he gave them pride, but he wouldn't fight. For months, he sat outside Washington, demanding more troops, more wagons, more certainty. He claimed the Confederate forces were too strong, that the weather was wrong, that the timing wasn't right. Lincoln grew impatient, but he didn't push McClellan directly. He wrote him warm, polite letters. He visited camp and praised the men. He thanked McClellan for his preparation. Then, he began to shift command decisions to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. He started reading other generals' reports with more interest. He asked McClellan for timetables, not opinions. And still, McClellan hesitated. Finally, Lincoln did what he had done so many times before. He created a trap of inaction. In late 1862, after the bloody Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was bold, risky, transformative. McClellan hated it. He believed the war should be fought only to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Suddenly, the ideological ground beneath him shifted. Now, to oppose Lincoln was to oppose emancipation. Public pressure mounted, newspapers turned, radical Republicans in Congress howled. Lincoln still said nothing. He let the forces move. And when the moment was right, on November 5, 1862, he relieved McClellan of command. No dramatic press release, no condemnation, just an order, delivered quietly, accepted quickly. Want the real telegrams from that maneuver? They're in the archive, just don't blink while reading. It wasn't just a personnel change. It was a masterclass in indirect pressure. Lincoln had orchestrated the perfect storm. Shift the political terrain, wait for the subject to lose favor, make the final decision look inevitable. By the time McClellan was gone, no one blamed Lincoln. In fact, many wondered why he hadn't acted sooner. And yet, Lincoln had never publicly criticized the man. This wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern. Lincoln didn't strike when angry. He waited for his opponents to discredit themselves. He built systems that exposed incompetence. Then he made surgical replacements, clean, quiet, and final. Let's look at another example. General John C. Fremont. In 1861, Fremont declared martial law in Missouri and ordered the emancipation of all slaves in the state. It was bold, morally right, politically dangerous. Border states threatened to secede. Lincoln, again, didn't lash out. He wrote Fremont privately, requesting he revise the order. Fremont refused. Lincoln didn't argue. He replaced him. Same pattern. Minimal words, maximum consequence. This wasn't coldness, it was containment. Lincoln believed that public fights created martyrs. Private decisions created outcomes, and nowhere was this clearer than in his relationship with his generals. He gave them rope, let them perform, let them write their own legacy. Then, if needed, he cut the rope, silently. Even when McClellan returned in 1864 as the Democratic presidential nominee, Lincoln refused to engage in public attacks. He let others compare their records. He let the war's momentum tell the story. He won re-election by 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. McClellan faded into history. Lincoln moved forward. That's not just victory, that's control. And this tactic extended beyond military affairs. Lincoln used the same method with Congress, with governors, with foreign diplomats. He rarely ordered, he suggested. He rarely threatened, he framed. He rarely demanded, he waited. And in the end, he almost always got what he wanted. It's no wonder British journalist Edward Dicey wrote, "Lincoln governs by indirection more effectively than most monarchs do by decree." So much of Lincoln's power came not from what he did, but from what he allowed others to reveal. He let silence do the heavy lifting. He let consequences do the talking. And he let history make the judgment. But that restraint, that calm, that composure, it all fed a larger myth. The myth of Lincoln as a purely gentle figure, as a soft-spoken father, a reluctant warrior, a man dragged into greatness. It's a myth worth examining, because behind that gentle smile was a man who made some of the hardest, bloodiest decisions in American history, and he did it with a clarity that should make us uncomfortable. We don't stop at YouTube. Join MetaFacts Legends across platforms. We drop facts daily. Chapter 10, The Myth of the Gentle Savior. We've all seen the image. Lincoln, gaunt and grave, seated with a Bible in his lap, his eyes weary, his heart full, a man of conscience, a man of destiny, a man who, in the darkest hour of the nation, stood up to evil and proclaimed liberty for all. It's an image carved in granite, etched in stained glass, recited in classrooms. The great emancipator, the reluctant warrior, the martyr president. But what if that version is only half the truth? What if the man we admire most for his moral clarity actually waited, measured, calculated? What if Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves not just because it was right, but because it was time? We've linked the timeline between slavery, war, and elections. Coincidence? You decide. Let's walk back to 1861. The war has begun. The South has seceded. Slavery is tearing the nation in half. Radical abolitionists are demanding immediate emancipation. But Lincoln holds the line. He insists the war is not about slavery, it's about preserving the Union. He says so, publicly, in letters, speeches, memos, because he's trying to keep four critical states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, in the Union. Border states, slave states. If he pushes too far, too fast, he risks losing them. So he waits. Now, that doesn't mean he's indifferent. Privately, Lincoln abhors slavery, always has. He called it a moral, social, and political evil. But presidents don't govern with private emotions. They govern with public action. And Lincoln doesn't move until the map tells him it's safe. Here's a key date, July 22nd, 1862. That's when Lincoln first shows his cabinet the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. But he doesn't publish it. Not yet. He tells his cabinet, "I shall not issue the document at this moment. I shall wait until the eagle of victory takes his perch on our banner." Translation: he needs a military win, because emancipation without strength would look like desperation, so he waits for Antietam. September 17th, 1862. It's the bloodiest single day in American history. More than 22,000 casualties. Technically a draw, but the Confederate Army retreats. Lincoln calls it a victory. 5 days later, he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Coincidence? No. Strategy. He knew the nation needed a cause. He knew foreign powers, especially Britain, were watching, waiting to see if the North would make slavery central to its mission. He gave them what they needed, but only when the time was right. It's what historian James McPherson calls moral timing, a collision of ethics and opportunity. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued formally on January 1st, 1863, is bold, historic, and, let's be honest, partial. It only applies to states in rebellion. It does not free slaves in loyal states. It's legally shaky, it's limited in scope, but politically, it's brilliant. It transforms the war into a moral crusade. It silences European critics. It energizes Black Americans, who begin enlisting in the Union Army by the tens of thousands. It reframes the entire conflict. And Lincoln, he becomes the great emancipator. But let's not forget, he waited. Frederick Douglass knew it. He said Lincoln was the slowest man in a race. But, Douglass added, once in, he was the surest. Lincoln wasn't a preacher, he was a tactician, and he only acted when action served multiple ends. Morality, yes, but also momentum, morale, and maps. It's uncomfortable to say, but it's necessary, because understanding Lincoln's strategy doesn't diminish his greatness. It clarifies it. It proves that progress is not always the product of idealism, but of execution. And that sometimes, the right thing must wait for the right time. There's a letter from 1862, written to Horace Greeley, that often gets cited as evidence of Lincoln's pragmatism. In it, Lincoln says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." That's not a contradiction, it's a window into a mind balancing belief and responsibility. Because presidents don't get to act alone. They need Congress, public opinion, generals, allies, elections. And Lincoln understood this better than anyone. So he waited, and when the country was ready, he moved. We see the same pattern throughout his presidency. In 1864, with re-election looming and the war going poorly, Lincoln quietly drafted a memo assuming he would lose. He even instructed his cabinet to sign it, unopened, to be read after the election. In it, he pledged to work with the new president, to save the Union before stepping aside. He didn't grandstand, he prepared for failure. That's not cowardice, that's governance. And yet, he won. Because Atlanta fell, because public opinion shifted, because the timing turned, and Lincoln was ready. That's the myth undone. He wasn't a saint, he wasn't a savior, he was a strategist, with a conscience. Not a prophet, but a planner. And in that complexity, we find a different kind of greatness. Not the kind carved in marble, but the kind that survives fire. In the next chapter, we'll explore a softer weapon, one that Lincoln used with devastating effect. His smile, his stories, his humor. Because behind the gravitas was a man who knew how to disarm a room, distract an enemy, and diffuse a crisis with a joke. And that, too, was no accident. Chapter 11, Humor as a Shield. Storytelling as control. He could walk into a room full of exhausted generals, infighting cabinet members, or bitter congressmen, and have them chuckling within minutes. Not because Abraham Lincoln told jokes, because he was the joke. Self-deprecating, homespun, awkward on purpose. The man wielded awkwardness like a shield and humor like a scalpel. But don't be fooled. He wasn't just being funny. He was buying time, reframing conflict, and winning. Lincoln's use of humor wasn't entertainment. It was strategy. And behind every laugh, there was a calculation. Every tale he told was a trap. We listed his most famous ones below. Decoded. Let's begin with one of his favorites. Told when pressured by critics to take a firmer stance on emancipation before 1862. He said, "I feel like the man who was tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail." Someone asked him how he liked it. He replied, "If it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd rather walk." Everyone laughed, even the journalists. But here's the twist. The joke wasn't about evading decision. It was a signal. Lincoln was showing that he understood the pressure, that he felt it, that he was enduring it for the good of the cause. He didn't need to defend his position. He made you laugh at your own demand. Humor, then, wasn't deflection, it was disarmament, and it bought him room to move. Take this one, told when he was being criticized for appointing too many rivals to his cabinet. "I'm like the man who put a dog into a meat grinder." When folks asked why, he said, "Well, I had to do something with the dog, and he seemed to fit." He never named the cabinet member. He didn't need to. The room got the message. And no one dared ask again. He once told a senator, "If you want to win a man to your cause, first convince him that you are his sincere friend. But if that fails, tell him a story so good he forgets why he was mad." The man walked away smiling. Lincoln smiled too. This wasn't performance, it was positioning, and it wasn't just with enemies. Even with his allies, Lincoln used humor to set boundaries. When abolitionist Wendell Phillips accused him of moving too slowly on emancipation, Lincoln quipped, "I must walk slowly, for I see many of my supporters are behind me." That line has been quoted as humility. It's actually a check. He was saying, "You don't drive me, I lead you." Soft words, hard message. Here's another layer. Lincoln's jokes almost always masked the real tension of the room. During the Civil War, whenever a military report came in late or bad news was brewing, Lincoln would tell a story before reading the memo. His aides thought he was stalling. He wasn't. He was absorbing the mood, calibrating the audience, measuring how much pressure the room could take. Then, once laughter had softened the walls, he would deliver the blow. Humor, for Lincoln, was a pressure release valve. Not for himself, for everyone else. Let's look at the science for a second. Studies on group dynamics, done long after Lincoln's time, show that laughter synchronizes emotional responses. It bonds people, it deactivates threat response in the brain. Lincoln did this instinctively, and when you consider that he led a country where every room he entered was fractured, north versus south, radical versus moderate, military versus civilian, you start to see the genius. He made fractured rooms feel safe enough to hear hard truths. That's not comedy, that's leadership. But there's a darker twist. Lincoln's humor also kept people from seeing how far ahead he really was. He downplayed his intellect. He called himself a simple man. He told reporters that he read Shakespeare when the words are short enough. He once said, "Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." He didn't mean that. He meant, let them underestimate you. That's how you win. Because when they're laughing, they're not watching. And when they're not watching, you move. This technique wasn't just useful in private. Lincoln used it on the national stage. At one press conference, when asked about the progress of the war, he responded, "Well, I'm reminded of the farmer who said his corn was about knee-high to a grasshopper with gout." Laughter. No follow-up, no probing questions, no headlines, just smoke. But in the smoke, Lincoln was maneuvering troops, testing policies, measuring states. In fact, some historians argue that Lincoln's public persona, the folksy rail splitter, was entirely engineered. That he amplified his backwards image to lower expectations, reduce pressure, and create trust with a population that mistrusted elites. Was it a lie? Not exactly. Lincoln did grow up poor. He did split rails, but the man also read Euclid for fun. He taught himself law, He wrote better prose than most authors of his era. He was no hick, he was a hypnotist. He used his image like he used his words, sparingly, strategically, and always with a purpose. So let's review. When people were angry, he told a joke. When the nation was grieving, he told a story. When generals were uncertain, he told a fable. And when the future looked impossible, he told a parable with hope baked inside. He turned emotion into narrative, and narrative into policy. And if you still think the jokes were harmless, ask yourself, how many other presidents have used punchlines to mask presidential decisions? We've listed Lincoln's most famous tales and their hidden meanings below. Read them, decipher them, see how many policies were hidden between the lines. So, yes, Lincoln was funny, but his humor was never innocent. It was a cloak, and behind the cloak was a man constantly calculating. Even when he smiled, his mind was working, and when others slept, he didn't, because Lincoln wasn't just a storyteller. He was a strategist with no off switch. Liking this kind of history? Click like so the algorithm knows what legends deserve to rise again. Chapter 12, The Mind That Never Slept. Abraham Lincoln didn't sleep like other men. He didn't eat like them either, or relax, or retreat. He paced, he muttered, he scrawled notes in the margins of law books at 3 a.m. He wrote letters he never sent and speeches no one would ever hear. He was always thinking, always asking questions, always answering himself. In the White House, his secretaries called it the midnight shuffle. They could hear his footsteps long after everyone else had gone to bed. Floorboards creaking, the rhythmic thud creak of a man walking not in exhaustion, but in battle with himself. This wasn't insomnia, it was obsession. A pencil sketch Lincoln made while the nation burned. We found it, it's in the vault below. Let's begin with his daily rhythm. Lincoln rarely woke early. He didn't hold cabinet meetings before 10 a.m., often pushing them into the afternoon. But that wasn't laziness, that was the residue of a mind that rarely shut off at night. He wrote most of his speeches and letters between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. By candlelight, sometimes by gas lamp, often alone. In fact, Lincoln kept scraps of paper in every coat pocket. He'd jot thoughts, phrases, half-drawn arguments wherever he was, in the carriage, in bed, even during dinner parties. His son Tad once found a crumpled piece of paper in Lincoln's boot with the words, "Can a people remain free if their own prejudices enslave them?" It wasn't labeled, it wasn't dated, just a question, written to no one but himself. Here's the twist. Lincoln didn't think like a politician. He thought like a chess player. He considered moves not just for tomorrow, but for 5 turns ahead. He'd ask, if I say this now, what will that senator do? What will that editor write? What will the army whisper? He didn't chase control, he created inevitability, and like any grandmaster, he didn't need to play fast, he just needed to move at the right moment. Historians have long puzzled over Lincoln's drafts, how much they evolved over time, how many versions existed, and how much thought he poured into each word. Take the Gettysburg Address, 272 words, but over 5 handwritten drafts. Lincoln revised placement of key phrases like "New Birth of Freedom," altering the emotional cadence of the entire speech. He wasn't just writing, he was composing. He once told a journalist, "I write things many times, not to get them right, but to get them true." That distinction matters. He wasn't searching for perfection. He was aligning language with meaning, and that required solitude. Let's talk about Lincoln's silent conversations. Multiple aides recorded seeing him pause in mid-sentence, then mumble quietly, sometimes repeating a phrase 3 or 4 times. Doesn't sound right, he'd mutter, then start again. Mary Todd Lincoln once walked into his study late at night and found him staring at a blank wall. No papers, no books, just silence. She asked what he was doing. He said, "Trying to see how it ends." She thought he meant the war. He meant the Union. The burden he carried was not administrative. It was existential. He wasn't managing politics. He was holding the identity of a nation between his fingertips, and he knew it could vanish. So he wrote and wrote and wrote. In letters to generals, he was polite but probing. In letters to editors, he was vague but firm. In personal notes, he was brutally honest. One entry read, "I am not fit for this office and never was." But he never showed that note to anyone. It was for him, because Lincoln didn't seek praise. He sought process. He once said, "If I am remembered, let it be for how I thought." And we do, because in his papers, his memos, his sketches, we see the shape of a mind that never shut off. One aide recalled that Lincoln often wrote with pencil on the back of used envelopes. He said they were flexible, like thoughts that hadn't settled yet. There's a sketch in our archive, linked below, of a proposed reconstruction plan. It was never sent to Congress, but it shows his thinking, state by state, what to offer, what to demand, when to strike, when to wait. He didn't ask, "Can I win?" He asked, "How do I win and leave the country standing?" That's a different level of thinking. Now, let's talk about pattern. Lincoln saw pattern in everything. In history, in war, in human behavior. He read Shakespeare not for entertainment, but for insight. He read Euclid, not to solve geometry, but to understand logic. He wanted to know what moved people, not just emotionally, but structurally. And this fed his rhetorical genius. Every speech had architecture, every letter had spine, every delay had intention. He told a friend once, "I have to chew the card longer than most men." That was humility. It was also a warning, because by the time Lincoln made a decision, it had already lived in his mind for days, weeks, sometimes years. Take the Emancipation Proclamation. We now know he began drafting it 6 months before he issued the first version. He didn't wait because he was scared. He waited because he was building consent, preparing allies, cornering enemies. So when he acted, it would be irreversible. This was the essence of his genius. The ability to suffer uncertainty in public while pursuing clarity in private. It's why he seemed slow, but struck with finality. Now, most men break under that kind of pressure. But Lincoln had one more tool. He recharged by stepping outside of himself. That's where the storytelling came in. The jokes, the anecdotes, the rail-splitter charm. Those weren't coping mechanisms. They were release valves, so the mind could reset, so the calculations could resume. And resume they did, until the day he died. Lincoln was still planning Reconstruction the night before he went to Ford's Theater. Still outlining what the country might become. Still asking questions no one had yet dared to answer. Still awake, because he knew, as long as the Union lived, he didn't get to sleep. Chapter 13. Why they underestimated him. He looked like a joke. Too tall, too thin, slumped posture, wrinkled clothes. His beard grew in patches. His hands were too big. His voice, high-pitched, nasal, flat. When he spoke in public, people whispered, "That's the president." Foreign diplomats called him grotesque. Cartoonists drew him as a baboon. His enemies called him a clown. Even some of his allies described him as melancholy, awkward, distracted. But Abraham Lincoln didn't care. Because while they laughed, he listened. And while they underestimated him, he watched. And by the time they realized what he was doing, he had already won. We collected portraits, sketches, and even handwriting samples. What do they tell you? Let's start with the optics. Lincoln wasn't just ignored, he was dismissed. During the 1860 Republican Convention, one newspaper called him a nobody from nowhere. When he was elected, Southern leaders declared him illegitimate. They believed no serious man could come from such a humble background. They said he lacked culture, sophistication, and spine. Stephen Douglas once called him two-faced, to which Lincoln famously replied, "If I had another face, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" The crowd laughed. Douglas didn't. Lincoln had turned insult into disarmament. And that was his pattern. He wore awkwardness like camouflage. He used humor as a fog machine. He made his enemies believe he didn't belong at the table. until he owned the table. Now let's talk about his actual physical presence. He stood at 6 feet 4 inches, an enormous height for the 19th century. In person, he towered over most men, but he slouched, hunched his shoulders, narrowed his presence. He made himself small until he spoke. Then, according to eyewitnesses, something changed. His eyes lit up, his voice steadied, his gestures sharpened. He grew into the room, and people who had laughed at his entrance found themselves silent by his second sentence. This isn't myth, it's recorded. Walt Whitman, yes, the poet, watched Lincoln speak once and wrote, "I saw a gaunt man suddenly become a mountain." But that mountain wasn't just voice and volume. It was clarity, because while his enemies relied on titles, polish, and reputation, Lincoln used something sharper: preparation. He didn't guess, he studied. He didn't bluff, he waited. He didn't dominate, he dissected. And most of all, he never let you see it coming. His handwriting was famously inconsistent, sometimes elegant, sometimes jagged, sometimes almost childlike. Historians puzzled over it, but some now believe he adjusted his style based on audience. He tailored his script like he tailored his speeches, simple where needed, elaborate where it mattered. In our archive, we've compiled samples of his handwritten notes. Side by side, they don't match, they adapt. So did he. Now, let's talk military. Early in the war, generals like McClellan thought Lincoln naive. Politicians like Seward thought him manipulable. Diplomats assumed he was provincial. None realized he was learning. Every report, every telegram, every letter, they passed through his hands. And he read them all. By 1862, Lincoln was making battlefield decisions with more precision than some of his own generals. By 1864, he was choosing battle timings to align with election strategy. He wasn't reacting, he was coordinating, all while appearing unsure, hesitant, unthreatening. Here's a twist. Confederate leadership believed Lincoln would fold after Antietam, after Fredericksburg, after Gettysburg, after the New York draft riots. They assumed the man couldn't stomach national chaos. They were wrong. Lincoln did more than stomach chaos. He fed on it. He used it as cover. He passed the most transformative legislation in American history while the country burned. He laid groundwork for the 13th Amendment while hiding behind humor and humility. He did not ask for trust. He earned control, and still, they didn't see it. Because the suit didn't fit. Because the beard was patchy. Because he looked like the punchline to a joke they didn't realize he was writing. It was a long con. Not in the criminal sense. In the strategic sense, Lincoln made being underestimated his operating principle. Because in politics, in war, in life, power is perception. And when people think you're not a threat, they hand you space, they give you time. And Lincoln used both like weapons. In his correspondence, he rarely wrote about how he felt. But in one private letter, he confessed, "I have been driven to my knees many times by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." That sounds like humility, but read it again. It's a man who feels the weight and keeps standing. He didn't posture, he persisted. So the next time you see his portrait, look closer. Not at the suit, not at the beard, not even the eyes. Look at the hands. They're not elegant. They're workman's hands. Long, gnarled, veined. Hands that held law books, war maps, letters of mourning, and the pen that signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't come from wealth. He didn't study in Paris. He never had command of a battalion. And yet, he outplayed them all. Because he understood the greatest truth in power. Underestimation is an advantage. And Lincoln built an empire under its cloak. Would you have trusted Lincoln or feared him? Let's hear your theory. Chapter 14. The final move they didn't see coming. April 14th, 1865. It was Good Friday. Washington basked with a rare mood. Relief. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered. The war, it seemed, was over. Union flags flew from rooftops. Bands played in the streets. For the first time in 4 long years, The White House windows were thrown open to the spring air. Abraham Lincoln, for the first time in months, smiled. But that wasn't what made this day different. What made it different was this: he was already planning his next war. We think of Lincoln's final day as peaceful, serene, triumphant, and in some ways, it was. But underneath the celebration, Lincoln was still moving pieces. He met with his cabinet that morning, the last full cabinet meeting of his life. And instead of relishing victory, he spoke of justice. He talked of bringing Confederate leaders to trial, not in rage, but in law. He sketched out the first outlines of Reconstruction, not a punishment, but a recalibration. He spoke of voting rights, of freedmen's schools, of rebuilding the South, not as it was, but as it could be. Then he signed a piece of paper, not a speech, not a proclamation, a routine document, by appearances, a pardon, but not just any pardon. It was the final order of mercy he would ever give, and the last document he would sign before the bullet. We found it. The last document he signed, hours before his assassination, tells a story no one talks about. It's right there. Lincoln's signature appears shaky, tired, but clear. The date reads April 14th. Time of death, approximately 7:22 p.m., April 15th. He signed it that afternoon. By nightfall, he was gone. But the timing isn't the twist. The twist is this: he didn't say what he was going to do next. He didn't announce it. He didn't warn anyone. There was no grand plan laid out, no published roadmap for the country to follow, no speech to the nation, no Reconstruction manifesto, because Lincoln's final move wasn't something he said. It was what he chose not to say. The real power of Lincoln wasn't in what he revealed. It was in what he concealed, until it was too late to stop him. And that was always the pattern. He never made declarations before he was ready. He never promised outcomes he couldn't secure. He worked in shadows, waited for the opening, then moved. At that last cabinet meeting, according to Secretary Gideon Welles, Lincoln said something strange. He told his ministers he'd had a dream, one he'd had before every major turning point in the war. In it, he saw a ship sailing with great speed toward a distant shore. Every time he'd had this dream, he said something big had happened within days. Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. Now, the dream had returned. Was it superstition, or was Lincoln already sensing what was next? Not for the war, but for himself. He had survived assassination attempts before. He had received death threats almost weekly. But on this day, he lowered his guard. He went to the theater and never came back. We all know the bullet. We know the balcony. We know the play. What we forget is that his plan, his real, unfinished plan, died with him. Reconstruction was handed off to men less patient, less strategic, less. Lincoln and America paid the price. But the clue, the most haunting clue, lies in what Lincoln didn't do on that last day. He didn't name successes. He didn't solidify policy. He didn't dictate the shape of the post-war order. He left space, deliberately. He trusted the strategy he had already set in motion, because he knew the final move had already been made. In silence, a president who spoke in parables, who led through deflection, who wielded humor like armor, who moved armies with quiet telegrams, who changed a nation without shouting, wouldn't need a final address. He would only need time. And history, as it turned out, didn't give him enough. But here's the real twist. Even in death, Lincoln's silence echoed louder than his words. His absence became a presence. His unfinished plans became battlefields. And his restraint, his refusal to rush the narrative, forced the nation to ask, again and again, what would Lincoln have done? That's not legacy. That's design. He crafted not just his presidency, but its myth. By saying less, he created more. By hiding the plan, he made us search for it. And in that search, we've discovered what real leadership looks like. Not force, not fury, but clarity without certainty, power without volume, vision without vanity. Lincoln's final move wasn't made on a battlefield. It was made with a pause, a withheld sentence, a signature at 4 p.m. on a quiet April afternoon. The nation never saw it coming. Next, Chapter 15. You've met the strategist. Now face the war. Want behind-the-scenes research notes, source books, and unreleased chapters? Follow us below. Chapter 15. You've met the strategist. Now face the war. The first shot of the Civil War was fired on April 12, 1861, but the war had started long before the cannons at Fort Sumter. It began in whispers, in letters, in debates, in campaign rooms and candlelit studies. It began when Abraham Lincoln stepped onto the national stage, not as a conqueror, not as a general, not even as a firebrand revolutionary, but as a quiet man playing a long game no one else saw. He was outnumbered, outfunded, outshouted, but not outmaneuvered. In the last 14 chapters, we've traced that game, move by move, bluff by bluff, a man who disguised strength as humility, who masked strategy as storytelling, who entered a war he never wanted, but won it without ever being the loudest voice in the room. This was not an accident. Lincoln understood something few others did. You don't change a nation by shouting at it. You change it by holding up a mirror, by letting it see its own contradictions, its own shame, its own possibility. And when the time is right, you move. Quietly, irrevocably. That was Lincoln, the strategist in the shadows. The man who set the board, and then invited the nation to play a game it didn't even know had begun. And when the cost of that game came due, when over 600,000 lives had been sacrificed on the altar of union and liberty, it was Lincoln who stood to answer for it. Not as a hero, but as a man who had calculated the weight of every life before lifting the pen. He didn't call it noble, he called it necessary, and he didn't run from it. He walked toward it, step by step, speech by speech, silence by silence. So now, we ask the question, what happens when the strategist wins? What happens when the war becomes real? When the whispers become gunfire? When the men he placed in power, the cabinet of rivals, each with their own agenda, start fighting not the Confederacy, but each other? When loyalty becomes currency and betrayal becomes strategy, that's where we go next. Because Lincoln didn't just fight the South, he fought the people in his own inner circle. The ones who thought they were in charge, the ones who tried to control him, the ones he had brought into his cabinet not to share power, but to contain it. Episode 2 begins there, inside a White House already cracking, inside a cabinet filled with ego, ambition, and silent war. The title, Enemies in the Cabinet, Lincoln's Dangerous Game. Because war was never just fought on the battlefield. It was fought behind closed doors. And Lincoln, he was already 3 moves ahead. But before you go, you've heard the whispers. Now touch the truth. Artifacts, maps, books, battle plans, all in the vault below. And if this story mattered to you, there's a button marked Donate. Lincoln's legacy lives on, because you believe it should. We'll see you in episode 2.